The courtroom was packed, a buzz of anticipation in the air. The trial of Aiden Cross, one of the most respected philanthropists in the country, had captured the attention of millions. He had built his empire on charity, on the belief that people could make a difference if they had the resources. But now that very empire was crumbling around him. The accusation? Embezzling millions of dollars from the very charity he had promised to help those in need. Aiden sat at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor now clouded by doubt. He had always prided himself on his integrity, on his ability to help the less fortunate, to change lives for the better. But now, his own life hung in the balance. The evidence presented against him was damning. Bank statements, wire transfers, and witness testimonies all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. He was guilty, or so it seemed. But there was one key witness who could change everything. Sophie, a young woman who had worked closely with Aiden at his charity. She had been the one to help him organize the charity's largest projects, the one who knew him best. If Sophie could testify, Aiden's defense could expose the truth. But just as the moment approached, Sophie mysteriously disappeared. No one knew where she had gone, or why she had vanished. Was she running from the truth? Or was she hiding something much darker? Aiden's lawyer, frantic and desperate, tried to keep the case moving forward. But the absence of Sophie left a hole in their defense. The prosecutor, cold and unyielding, pounced on every inconsistency, pushing the narrative that Aiden had manipulated Sophie and others for his own gain. With Sophie gone, Aiden had no one left to trust. The courtroom was alive with speculation. Whispers filled the air. Was Aiden Cross, the beloved philanthropist, truly the villain here? Or was he the victim of a much larger, more dangerous plot? As the trial dragged on, the pressure mounted. Aiden's public persona began to crack under the weight of the accusations, and the public's opinion was shifting. The media portrayed him as a man who had deceived not only his donors but the world itself. A man who had used his charity as a cover for his own greed. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, a bombshell dropped. A new piece of evidence was introduced. An audio recording of Sophie's final conversation with someone close to Aiden. The words on the tape were chilling. He doesn't know. He never knew what I was doing. The courtroom fell silent. Who was Sophie talking to? What had she been hiding? And more importantly, what did Aiden not know about the crime he was accused of? As the judge called for a recess, the whispers in the courtroom only grew louder. Aiden sat motionless, his mind racing. Everything he thought he knew about the case, about the people closest to him, was beginning to unravel. The truth was just out of reach. But what if Aiden wasn't the one who needed to be defended? What if he had been framed from the very beginning? Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. The recess gave everyone a moment to breathe, but in the silence that followed, the weight of the courtroom's tension only seemed to grow heavier. Aiden sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him, his mind spinning with questions. Who could Sophie have been speaking to? What did she mean by, "He never knew what I was doing"? The words echoed in his ears, gnawing at him. He had always trusted Sophie. She had been one of his closest allies in his charity work, a woman with a heart for the cause, someone he believed shared his vision. So why would she betray him? And if she hadn't been involved in the embezzlement, why had she disappeared at the most critical moment? Aiden's thoughts were interrupted as his lawyer, Greg, approached him with a furrowed brow. "We need to get ahead of this," Greg said, his voice tight. "The prosecution is going to use that recording to paint you as a liar. Someone who knew exactly what was going on but chose to cover it up." "I didn't know," Aiden replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, Greg, I didn't know." Greg nodded, but his concern didn't fade. He knew that Aiden was a good man, but the evidence mounting against him painted a different picture. The public was already turning. The media had picked up on the case, and every news outlet seemed to be covering it with a new, more damning angle. Headlines like "Philanthropist" or "Fraud" and "The Secret Life of Aiden Cross" screamed from the screens. People were questioning everything they had once believed about him, and that was before the tape had even surfaced. The tape was the game changer. No one had expected Sophie to be implicated like this. If she had truly been deceiving Aiden all along, it meant that everything, every donation, every partnership was built on a lie. The possibility that someone had played him, used his good intentions to cover up their own greed, was a reality he couldn't wrap his head around. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread like wildfire. Rumors about Sophie's sudden disappearance swirled, and some even suggested that she had gone into hiding because she feared for her safety. Aiden didn't know what to believe anymore. He had always prided himself on his ability to see through people, to know who was trustworthy and who wasn't. But now it seemed like the world he had built was crumbling around him. His thoughts were interrupted again, this time by the sound of the doors opening. The judge had returned to the bench. The room fell silent once more, all eyes fixed on the proceedings as the trial resumed. Aiden straightened up, trying to appear calm despite the turmoil inside him. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the judgment that had already begun. Every move he made was scrutinized. Every word he spoke was analyzed for hidden meaning. It was as if his entire life was on trial, not just the charges of embezzlement. The prosecutor stood, and his voice rang out across the courtroom, cold and unyielding. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have already shown you the evidence that proves Aiden Cross is guilty of embezzling funds from his charity. But now, we have something even more damning. A confession from an accomplice who worked alongside Mr. Cross for years. Aiden's heart dropped. Was he hearing this right? Accomplice? Who else could be involved? The prosecutor continued, holding up a series of documents. This is a series of emails between Sophie Monroe and an unidentified individual, detailing the distribution of the stolen funds. We believe this person is none other than Mr. Cross himself, unknowingly complicit in the operation. Aiden's world seemed to spin. Unknowingly complicit? He had never seen these emails before. He had never heard of this so-called accomplice. His mind raced, but before he could gather his thoughts, the prosecutor dropped the next bombshell. We've also traced several large transfers made from Mr. Cross's personal account to an offshore bank. The same account used to funnel money from the charity. The room seemed to close in on him. How could this be happening? Who had been setting him up, and for how long? The questions kept piling up, each one more urgent than the last. And just when it seemed like Aiden couldn't sink any lower, the prosecutor turned to the jury, his voice a chilling whisper. We will prove that Aiden Cross isn't just a thief. He's a man who has deceived everyone he's ever claimed to help. And once you see the full extent of his lies, you'll understand just how deep this betrayal runs. The words hung in the air, thick with menace, as Aiden sat frozen in his chair, his mind desperately trying to piece together the fragments of a life that now felt like a cruel puzzle. The prosecutor's words hung in the air, and Aiden felt the courtroom shift beneath him. The weight of every eye in the room felt like a physical pressure on his chest. As the judge called for order, the prosecution's team began presenting more evidence, each piece more damning than the last. They showed images of transfers from Aiden's personal account to offshore bank accounts. They showed emails, photos, and even messages on Sophie's phone that appeared to confirm their claims. The accusations were becoming impossible to ignore. But there was one thing that didn't sit right with Aiden. The more evidence they presented, the more he started to doubt the narrative. His mind raced back to the moments he had shared with Sophie, the late nights working together, the conversations about their shared dreams of helping those in need. Sophie had always seemed like a partner in his vision. She had been loyal, passionate, and the one person he trusted above all others. Could she have really been deceiving him all along? Had she been playing him for months, maybe even years? It didn't make sense. His thoughts were interrupted when Greg, his lawyer, leaned in closer. Aiden, I know this looks bad, but we can't give up. We need to figure out what's really going on here. Sophie's disappearance, the evidence, they're all part of a bigger plan. Someone's setting you up. Aiden looked up at him, his eyes filled with confusion and panic. Who? Who would want to set me up like this? And why? Greg hesitated, glancing toward the jury, making sure no one was listening too closely. I don't know yet, but it's too clean, too convenient. The way Sophie disappeared, the way the emails were discovered. Someone's pulling the strings behind the scenes, Aiden's heart sank. He hadn't considered that possibility. Someone using Sophie to orchestrate this entire scheme. But who? And why? The courtroom suddenly felt suffocating. Aiden felt the walls closing in on him, and for the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. The truth was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. Meanwhile, across the room, the prosecutor watched Aiden closely, a slight smirk playing on his lips. He knew the defense had no real chance of winning. The evidence was airtight, but what was even more satisfying was seeing Aiden, once a symbol of integrity, unravel before everyone. The prosecutor had once been one of Aiden's interns, a young man eager to make a name for himself in the legal world. He had watched Aiden from the sidelines, admired his success, even looked up to him. But the more he saw, the more he realized how much of it was a carefully constructed facade. Aiden was just like everyone else. Flawed, manipulative, driven by his own need for power and control. What the prosecutor didn't know was that he, too, was being manipulated. He didn't know the full story, the layers of corruption that ran deeper than just Aiden Cross. He didn't know that the person behind all of this wasn't Aiden, but someone far more dangerous. Someone who had been playing both sides from the shadows. The prosecutor turned his attention back to the jury, his eyes scanning their faces for any sign of doubt. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimonies. The defense will try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding. But there is no misunderstanding here. Aiden Cross took what didn't belong to him and betrayed the very people he promised to help. As he spoke, a figure stood in the back of the courtroom, unnoticed by most. It was Sophie's father, a quiet, unassuming man who had been absent from the trial up until now. He had been watching from a distance, keeping his presence a secret. But now, something about the prosecutor's words stirred him. He knew more than anyone what Sophie had been involved in. And more than anyone, he knew that Aiden wasn't the true villain of this story. Sophie's father had never trusted Aiden. He had always suspected that the philanthropist's ambitions went beyond helping the poor and that there were darker motivations behind his charitable work. But even he hadn't been able to predict how far things would go. Sophie's disappearance wasn't a random act. It was part of a larger plan, one that involved far more than just money. Aiden's thoughts swirled as he tried to focus on the trial. His lawyer's voice cut through his haze of confusion, urging him to stay calm, to keep fighting. Aiden, we're not done yet. You can still turn this around. We need to find Sophie. She's the key to everything. But how could he find her? He had no leads, no real idea of where she could be. And even if he did find her, what would she say? What if she was in on it all along? The uncertainty gnawed at him. The mystery surrounding Sophie's disappearance was growing, and with it, his desperation. He needed answers. But the more he searched for the truth, the more he realized that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous this entire situation was becoming. And then, just as the trial reached its peak, another bombshell was dropped. An anonymous letter slipped into the prosecutor's hands, revealing a connection between Sophie and someone in Aiden's inner circle, someone he had trusted implicitly for years. The letter was handed over to the prosecutor quietly, almost too casually, as if it were just another piece of evidence. But the moment he unfolded it, his eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. The courtroom, still tense from the last few hours, seemed to hold its breath as the prosecutor glanced up, a cold glimmer in his eye. He didn't say anything right away, but the change in his demeanor was enough to unsettle everyone. Aiden's heart skipped a beat. What could this letter contain? Was it more bad news? He felt a cold sweat bead at his brow, his mind racing to think of any connection, any person in his life who might be implicated by whatever was written inside. The prosecutor cleared his throat, making a show of pausing before reading aloud. This letter, which we received anonymously, contains information linking Sophie Monroe to someone in Mr. Cross's inner circle, someone who's been with him since the beginning. His voice was steady, deliberate, his eyes scanning the room as if savoring every moment. According to this letter, Sophie was not working alone. She had help, and that help came from someone Mr. Cross trusted implicitly. Aiden's stomach churned. Someone close to him? Who? His mind flashed through the names of those in his charity, his board members, colleagues, staff, anyone who had access to his accounts, his personal dealings. But none of them stood out. Who could have betrayed him so completely? The prosecutor continued, letting the tension build. This person, according to the letter, was none other than Simon Westbrook, the head of Aiden Cross's financial department. Aiden's breath caught in his throat. Simon, his most trusted employee, the one person who had been with him through every major decision, every financial transaction, every donation. Aiden had built his entire charity's success on the foundation of people like Simon. People who were loyal, capable, and reliable. The thought that Simon could have been involved in this scheme, orchestrating the entire thing from within, was impossible to fathom. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him again, their gaze sharp, waiting for him to respond. But the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't even bring himself to look at Simon, who was sitting quietly in the front row, his expression unreadable. Was it true? Could Simon have been using his position to manipulate the charity's finances, all while Aiden remained blind to it? How long had this been going on? The room was silent, the weight of the accusation hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Aiden glanced over at Greg, his lawyer, who was visibly tense, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "We need to get ahead of this," Greg muttered under his breath. "This is too much. We need to call Simon in for questioning. We need to turn the tide before it's too late." But Aiden couldn't move. His mind was still reeling from the revelation. He had trusted Simon like a brother. They had worked side by side for years, building this charity from the ground up. To think that Simon could be involved in something so insidious was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything Aiden had ever experienced. Then, just as the prosecutor was about to make his closing statement, the courtroom doors swung open. Everyone turned in unison, their eyes wide with surprise. A figure stepped into the room, casting a long shadow in the doorway. It was Sophie. She was back. A murmur swept through the room, a mixture of shock and disbelief. Sophie's sudden reappearance was as mysterious as her disappearance, and all eyes were now locked on her. She looked different, disheveled, her eyes dark with exhaustion. But there was something about her presence that sent a ripple of tension through the room. She didn't look like someone who had been hiding in fear. She looked like someone who had been watching, waiting for the right moment to return. The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court," he called. But the room was already buzzing with questions. Sophie didn't look nervous or remorseful. In fact, she looked more resolved than anyone had ever seen her. She moved slowly down the aisle, her eyes flicking from Aiden to Simon, to the prosecutor, before settling on the judge. "I need to speak," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I know everything, and I'm not going to let this go any longer." The room went still. Aiden's pulse raced in his ears. Was she here to confess? To finally reveal the truth? Or was this just another twist in the tangled web that had been spun around him? Sophie took a deep breath, her gaze locking onto Aiden's. "You've been lied to, Aiden," she said, her voice softer now, though the words carried a weight that seemed to press down on him. "You've been played by someone you trusted. But the truth, the real truth, is much bigger than you think." Aiden felt his stomach drop. His entire world was shifting under his feet, and now Sophie, the one person who had always seemed like a pillar of truth, was telling him there was more to this story than he could possibly understand. But what could she mean? What truth had she been keeping from him? The courtroom held its breath, waiting for her next words. "I'm not the one who stole from the charity," Sophie continued, glancing at Simon. "It wasn't me. It was Simon. He's the one who's been pulling the strings all along." Aiden's mind went blank. Simon? The man who had worked beside him for so long? The man who had helped build everything Aiden stood for? Aiden turned slowly to face Simon, who was now standing up, his face pale, his lips pressed tightly together. And for the first time, Aiden saw something in Simon's eyes, something cold and calculating, something that made his blood run cold. The tension in the room was palpable. Sophie had just dropped the final bombshell. But Aiden still didn't know who to trust anymore. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. All eyes were now on Simon, whose face had drained of color. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Sophie's words were hanging in the air, suspended, their weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Aiden's heart pounded in his chest. Could it really be Simon? Had he been blind to the signs all along? The man who had helped build everything, the one Aiden had trusted like family, was he the mastermind behind the embezzlement? But before Aiden could fully process the shock, Sophie turned back to the judge, her gaze firm and unwavering. "There's more," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "The truth isn't just about Simon. It's about Aiden, too. Both of you have been part of something much bigger than you realized. You've been pawns in a game that started long before you ever knew." Aiden froze. Sophie had just cast an accusation at him, too, one that felt like a punch to the gut. His head swam with confusion. What was she saying? How could she suggest that he was involved in something deeper, something sinister? Was it possible that he, too, had been unknowingly complicit in the crime? Sophie's eyes locked onto Aiden's. "You think this is about the charity's funds. But it's not. It never was," she said, her voice calm but laced with an edge of something darker, more calculating. "This is about power, control. And the real mastermind is someone none of you ever suspected. Someone much closer than you think." Aiden's breath caught in his throat. Who could she possibly be talking about? Who else was involved in this twisted web? Sophie's gaze shifted, and for a brief second, she looked toward the prosecutor. Aiden's stomach twisted in knots. Could it be? Was the prosecutor playing a role in all of this? Had he known the truth all along? Had he been working with Simon or even manipulating Sophie? The prosecutor, who had been silent during Sophie's revelations, suddenly stood. He addressed the judge with an air of authority, his tone steady but a little too practiced. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these allegations are speculative at best. I don't see any evidence linking me to these accusations. This is a desperate attempt to shift blame." But Sophie didn't back down. "Oh, it's not just me," she said, turning her focus on him. "You're part of it too. The money, the donations, the funds that were funneled through the charity. You've been using your position to manipulate the media, to create a narrative. You knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes. You and Simon were the ones pulling the strings, controlling the narrative, making sure Aiden never figured it out." The prosecutor's face twitched, his mask of control cracking ever so slightly. "You have no proof of these absurd claims." Sophie took a step forward. "You want proof? I'll give you proof. The emails, the bank records, the phone calls you've had with Simon. It's all in here," she said, pulling out a file from her bag and throwing it onto the table in front of the prosecutor. "Everything you've been hiding is in these documents. It's all connected. You knew Simon was the one stealing from the charity, but you made sure Aiden stayed in the dark. And when he got too close to the truth, you made sure he would be the one blamed." The courtroom erupted into murmurs as everyone processed Sophie's accusation. Aiden's mind was spinning. If what she said was true, then everything he had believed about the case, about the people he had trusted, was a lie. Could the prosecutor really be in on it? Was he manipulating this entire trial to make Aiden the fall guy? So what was his motive? But Sophie wasn't finished. She turned to the judge and spoke with a chilling clarity. "There's one more thing. The mastermind behind this whole operation isn't just trying to frame Aiden. They're trying to destroy him. And the reason is simple: they want to take over the charity. They want to take everything Aiden has built and turn it into something else entirely." Aiden felt a sharp sting in his chest. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. The charity he had poured his heart and soul into was the prize in a much larger game, one he hadn't even realized he was playing. Sophie was right. He had been a pawn, but so had Simon, so had the prosecutor, and so had everyone else involved. The real question now was who had orchestrated this entire scheme from the shadows. Before Aiden could gather his thoughts, the judge spoke, his voice grave. "This is a serious accusation, Ms. Monroe. If you're claiming that the prosecutor is involved, you'll need more than just words. You'll need hard evidence." Sophie nodded, her expression unreadable. "I know," she said, "and I have it. The real question is, who wants to stop me from exposing it?" Aiden's blood ran cold as he realized what she was suggesting. Sophie had been holding onto the truth, knowing that if she revealed it all at once, someone would make sure she never spoke again. Someone with enough power to shut her down. A sudden chill swept through the room as the stakes escalated higher than anyone had expected. The trial was no longer just about Aiden's innocence, it was about survival. Someone, somewhere, was determined to see him fall, and they would stop at nothing to make sure it happened. Aiden's mind raced. If Sophie was right and the prosecutor was involved, then the trial wasn't just rigged, it was a carefully crafted attack on his life. But who could he trust now? With everything at stake, the truth was becoming harder to grasp, and the walls were closing in. And as Sophie glanced back at Simon, her eyes locking onto his with a knowing look, Aiden understood that the final revelation was coming. But would he be ready for it? Or would the conspiracy around him tighten its grip before he had a chance to fight back? The courtroom was buzzing with energy as everyone processed Sophie's words. For the first time, Aiden felt a flicker of hope. Sophie had just given him the opening he needed, but the tension was still thick in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Sophie didn't wait for the judge's command. She stood tall, unwavering, her eyes locked on the prosecutor. "You don't get to control this anymore," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The truth is bigger than your manipulation, and I won't let you twist it any longer." The prosecutor's expression faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. He looked down at the file Sophie had thrown onto the table and then back at the judge, his jaw tightening. Aiden could see it now, the cracks in the prosecutor's carefully crafted mask. For all his confidence, for all his manipulation, there was fear now. "Enough, Ms. Monroe," the judge said, his voice booming through the room. "If you're suggesting that the prosecutor is involved in these allegations, we need hard proof. Otherwise, this trial is over." Sophie nodded and looked to the back of the courtroom. The doors opened, and a man in a suit walked in. Someone Aiden didn't recognize. The man moved swiftly, with purpose, and handed a thick envelope to the judge. "This is the proof you asked for," the man said. He was calm, unbothered by the eyes now fixed on him. The judge accepted the envelope, his hands steady. He opened it and began scanning the contents. The courtroom was silent again, every person waiting for the truth to unfold. Aiden's stomach churned as he watched the judge's face. He could see the change. A slight frown, then a moment of disbelief. The judge looked up, locking eyes with Aiden. This is beyond what I expected." Sophie stepped forward. "I knew you wouldn't believe me on just words alone. But here it is, the evidence that proves everything. The prosecutor, the money transfers, the fake media reports, the manipulated bank accounts. It's all here in black and white. This man has been orchestrating everything behind the scenes." The judge's face was unreadable as he read the documents. His eyes flicked from Simon to the prosecutor, and then to Aiden, his expression growing darker with each passing second. "This is serious," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "If these documents are real, then this trial, everything, has been part of an elaborate scheme." The room was still. Aiden was in shock, trying to piece everything together. Sophie had known all along. She'd been working from the inside, gathering the evidence piece by piece. She had been the one to unravel the web that had ensnared him. But what was the real motive behind this? Who had orchestrated it all? Suddenly, the prosecutor spoke, his voice shaky but defiant. "This is ridiculous. You're accusing me without evidence. You have nothing." "Shut up," Sophie cut him off, her voice cold. "You don't get to control the narrative anymore. You were never going to let Aiden expose the truth, were you? You've been playing a part in something much bigger, something much darker. It was never about money, it was about power." The prosecutor's face twisted with a mix of fear and anger. "You think you can stop me? You have no idea what you're up against. There are people—" Before he could finish, a loud bang rang out, and the courtroom doors flew open again. This time it wasn't a lawyer or a witness entering. It was a police officer holding a set of handcuffs. "This man is under arrest," the officer said, stepping forward toward the prosecutor. "You're under investigation for embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and several other charges related to the charity. You've been caught, and you won't be able to escape this time." The prosecutor's face turned pale, his defiance evaporating in an instant. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The officer moved quickly, cuffing him, and the courtroom erupted into chaos. Simon, who had remained silent up until now, stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. Aiden turned toward him, his stomach churning as the truth hit him with full force. Simon had been involved, yes, but he wasn't the only one. The prosecutor had been the true mastermind. But just as Aiden thought everything was about to collapse into a moment of resolution, Sophie turned to him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held something deeper, something he hadn't expected. "You're free, Aiden," she said quietly. "But the real battle has just begun." Aiden frowned, confused. "What do you mean? Isn't this over?" Sophie's eyes flicked to the man who had handed over the envelope, the one who had appeared out of nowhere to deliver the final blow. "Not yet," she said, her voice low but certain. "This isn't just about the charity. It's about the people behind it, the ones who want to take it all, and who will stop at nothing to get it." Aiden's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you talking about?" But before she could answer, the man who had delivered the envelope stepped forward. His expression had been calm throughout, but now, as he looked at Aiden, there was a flicker of something else, something that made Aiden's blood run cold. "I'm sorry, Aiden," the man said, his voice soft, "but I'm afraid you've been part of this game much longer than you think. You weren't just a pawn. You were the king, and now it's time for you to move." Aiden's head spun. What are you talking about?" The man smiled, but it was a cold, knowing smile. "You didn't think the charity was your real legacy, did you? There's so much more. And you've been playing your part in it from the very beginning. You're not the victim here. You're the player. And now the game is about to change." The twist hit Aiden like a punch to the gut. Everything he had believed, the life he thought he was living, the causes he thought he stood for, had all been a carefully orchestrated plan. He was no longer sure who the real villains were. But one thing was certain. The final act had just begun, and it was a game he couldn't escape. Aiden stood frozen, trying to comprehend the words that had just been spoken. His mind raced, but nothing made sense. He had been part of this grand scheme all along? How was that possible? He had spent years building the charity, pouring his heart into it, believing he was doing good in the world. And yet here he was, hearing from a man he didn't even know that his entire life was part of a larger game, one he had unknowingly been playing. The man, still standing by the judge's bench, finally spoke again. "You've been a part of this network, Aiden. The charity was never just about giving back. It was a front, a way to mask something far more lucrative and dangerous. You've been a tool in a system designed to manipulate, control, and ultimately profit from the very people you thought you were helping." Aiden felt his legs weaken, and he gripped the edge of the table for support. "What do you mean? I never signed up for this." His voice was barely a whisper, his breath coming in short gasps. Sophie stepped forward, her expression no longer just the confident, driven woman who had revealed the prosecutor's involvement. Now there was a deep sadness in her eyes. "You didn't know, Aiden. I'm not blaming you, but the truth is you were always meant to play this role. Your public persona, the charity, your rise in the media, they were all part of the plan. The ones controlling everything saw you as the perfect figurehead. The man who had handed over the evidence, the one who had called Aiden a player in the game, smiled, but it wasn't comforting. And you, Sophie," he said, his tone laced with something colder now, "you were supposed to be the one to reveal the truth when the time was right. But even you didn't realize how deep this went." Sophie looked away, her jaw tightening. "I thought I was fighting for the right cause. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized I was playing right into their hands. The question now is, what do we do with this information? What's left of our choices?" Aiden didn't know how to respond. The world he thought he understood had crumbled. His charity, his entire legacy, It was all part of a twisted manipulation by faceless people behind the scenes, and now, his role in it was undeniable. The guilt was suffocating, but he couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to make things right. Sophie glanced at the judge, who had been quietly observing the conversation. Finally, the judge stood and addressed the courtroom. This trial, as you've seen, is about much more than the embezzlement of funds. It's about the people who have used power for personal gain, who have built entire systems of manipulation under the guise of charity and goodwill. His gaze turned to Aiden. But Mr. Cross, it's clear that you were just as much a victim in this as you were a participant. The question now is what comes next. Aiden's thoughts spiraled as he realized the depth of what the judge was saying. There was no easy way out. He had been a pawn, but now it seemed like the only path forward was to fight back. The man behind the curtain, the true mastermind of this entire operation, was still out there, watching, waiting. And the only way to stop this cycle was to expose them all. "I won't run from this," Aiden said suddenly, his voice firm despite the doubts clouding his mind. "I will make sure everything is exposed. The charity, the conspiracy, the people who've been pulling the strings. They've taken enough from the world already. It's time to take it back." Sophie looked at him, her face a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you sure you're ready for that, Aiden? This is bigger than any of us." Aiden nodded slowly. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was taking control of his own destiny. The road ahead would be hard, and the truth would come with consequences. But he couldn't stand by any longer, watching as others used the system to destroy lives, including his own. With the prosecutor now in custody, and the evidence stacked against him, the trial came to an unexpected and swift conclusion. The public was left to wrestle with the fallout of the revelations about the charity, the corruption, and the manipulation at the highest levels of power. As the story of Aiden's downfall spread, so did the awareness of the much larger conspiracy lurking in the shadows. For Aiden, the battle wasn't over. The real fight, the one that would define his legacy, was only just beginning. He would no longer be the figurehead of a system he didn't understand. He would be its destroyer, its unmasker, and in that, there was a quiet hope that even in the darkest of games, redemption was still possible. But as Aiden walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the truth pressing on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were still players out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The game wasn't over. Not yet. And somewhere, in the shadows, the true mastermind was watching, waiting for the next move.